Dear friends, King David is a myth. Or to be more precise, David and his son Solomon are legendary kings together with the tales of the so-called unified kingdom. It needs to be said loud and clear because assumptions of their historicity is so widespread among fundamentalists as well as some secular people for political reasons. And it casts a dark, gruesome shadow over the Middle East all the way until now. We can start with a literary argument about their non-historicity. A scholar of the Hebrew Bible, John van Setters, published a book where he called it the biblical saga of King David. There might be a grain of history here and there. It might be composed from some older material, but this composition in this entirety is thoroughly fictitious and quite late. It was composed and written down hundreds and hundreds of years after David and Solomon supposedly lived. Something like 600, perhaps even 700 years after their alleged dates. And how do we know that this cycle of legends is that late? I have spoken about it before on this channel. And one of the arguments is because these legends are full of obvious anachronisms. A perfect example might be one of the best known stories about David. I mean that about David and Goliath. Goliath's armor, but also David's weapon, his famous sling, closely fit the military practice centuries after it supposedly happened. Further, the language, vocabulary, and grammar of these legends is an hodgepodge of different archaisms. Honestly, it looks like authors were trying to project a great age, but were unable to settle on one specific period. But for me, the most convincing argument is the argument from genre. These legends were written in prose. They were not written in epic poetry. I know, and I personally translated, and I can read late Bronze Age West Semitic royal legends of King Keret and Daniel, supposedly just a century or so older than those of King David. And thus I know how such archaic storytelling is to look, how it reads, how it feels. I know its vocabulary, its style, and also its mental space. And that is not what we have in these stories of David and Solomon. As I have said, the most obvious sign is that the legends of David and Solomon are not epic poetry. They are written in common prose, and that is a great and undisputable problem. Thus, I am convinced that the stories of David and Solomon were not composed and they were not written down before Herodotus, or even better, before Xenophon, and very likely quite later than that. That would be 600 or even 700 years after the period into which David and Solomon were situated. By the way, my Edinburgh teacher of Ugaritic and West Semitic religion, Nicholas Wyatt, had a tantalizing theory. The personal name David is rather unique among ancient sources. And so my teacher suggested that rather than being a personal name, it was derived from a terminology of a clan relationships, and in the royal context quite likely was a title for the royal prince, the successor on the throne, the beloved, the darling, the chosen by an unmentioned, unnamed patron deity. So these are arguments from the literary criticism, stories about David and Solomon were late legends, possibly composed of some older legendary material. Nevertheless, in the current form, they were late literary creations. Now, let us talk about history and archaeology. These late legends do not have any reasonable and believable foundation in history. Those legends want us to believe that these kings ruled over a vast early Iron Age Near Eastern empire. But friends, there is no historical trace of such an empire. Not a single trace anywhere. And it is not because we would not have records from surrounding kingdoms and empires, but they never mention this supposedly fabulous and powerful empire of King David. Outside of the Bible, there are no traces of David's and Solomon's empire, not from allies nor from enemies. The center of their empire was supposedly situated in the Judean hills and was moved to Jerusalem, which was then built up into an impressive and glamorous capital city. Archaeology cannot find such Jerusalem. Archaeologists show the Judean hills were at that time settled with a semi-nomadic people, living in small villages and tiny towns. And decades of diligent archaeological research has not found much of Davidic and Solomonic Jerusalem. Whatever was found only confirms this uncomfortable truth. Exactly how little was discovered. There is, of course, a famous Tel Dan stela, badly broken and difficult to interpret. It mentions Bet David, house of David, in a sense of royal house of David. But this royal house of David, Bet David, does not prove historicity of King David. Quite the opposite. It tells us only what we've known, that the later kings of Judea traced their lineage to this legendary figure. And that's it. Just like a late medieval mention of King Arthur does not prove historicity of this legendary leader of the Knights of the Round Table. Perhaps, very much perhaps, there might have been a historical king, Arthur. And there also might have been kings David and Solomon. But if they ever existed, they were very different from what we know from the literature. They were local warlords from the dusty Judean hills. And one more thing. Almost all biblical and Middle East scholars agree on one thing. David was definitely not, emphatically not, a king of Israel. His dominion, if it ever existed, was over semi-arid Judean hinterlands. Israel was altogether a different kingdom. There was never, ever, unified kingdom until the time of Maccabeans in Hellenistic times. And so talking about Israel, that so-called northern kingdom, there is a slowly establishing opinion that the legend of David and Solomon were actually inspired by this other, wealthier, and historically well-documented kingdom, with its capital in Samaria. King Omri was the founder of the first Israelite dynasty. He was followed by his even more powerful son Ahab, or Ahab, the one who married foreign princess Jezebel, or Jezabel. In the Bible, Samaria, Omri, Ahab, and his queen Jezebel got badly vilified, while their achievements and glamour were transferred or stolen for their southern Judean neighbors and projected a few generations further back. So now to sum it up. One thing. King David, if he lived at all, was never a king of Israel. 2. He was a chief of a small kingdom in mountainous backcountry called Judea. 3. The stories of his exploits are a hodgepodge of originally oral legends from different time periods. 4th, those legends were made into a cycle in Hellenistic period hundreds of years after the period when he supposedly lived. 5. David and Solomon legendary greatness was borrowed, if you allow stolen, from a real historical kings, Omri and Ahab, who were cast as biblical arch-villains. 6. Thus the real kings of Israel were suppressed while fictitious mythical kings of Judea were lifted up. 7. And all of this is well established and has been known for decades among the biblical theologians and ancient Near East scholars. And finally, 8. All this does not diminish religious and theological significance of the legend of King David and his son Solomon. On the contrary, this epos or these eposes should be liberated from ideological and geopolitical abuses into which they got ensnared throughout centuries, and especially in the last 2 centuries, and caused immeasurable suffering and tens upon tens of thousands of lives. Misinterpreted and twisted myths and legends can indeed be very dangerous, and it is the role for theologians and Near East scholars to correct the records.